I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism. I'm here at Birkbeck, and I'm delighted to see all of you here this morning and later through the next 2 days, those of you who can stay, to talk about Muslims and Jews, citizenship, identity and prejudice in Europe, the US and Israel. And I thought I would just sort of start just with a few words about why we are here, though not in a theological sense. And in the announcement that I sent round and to which you responded, I highlighted three themes or three questions. One concerning the ways in which Jews and Muslims respond to a multicultural society and multiculturalism in Britain. Secondly, the ways in which Antisemitism and Islamophobia impact on Jews and Muslims in Britain today. And thirdly, what relationship, if any, is there between those two issues and the ways in which the politics of Israel and Palestine are enacted in Britain and Europe today? Now, these might or might not appear to be a naturally coherent set of questions. But I think what's important to say is that for some people, they clearly are. And let me give one example of this. A book by by Robin Shepherd, A State Beyond the Pale, Europe's Problem with Israel, which was published a couple of years ago. Shepherd was a Times journalist. He worked for the Chatham House think tank and now is the Director of International Affairs at the Henry Jackson Society. And Shepherd's argument, and I give him as an example of an argument which is more widely current, both in Britain, in Israel, and in Europe, among many of Israel's supporters, goes as follows: that much of the problem that Europe has with Israel lies not with Israel, with its activities, with the occupation, with the grievances of Palestinians and the Palestinian claims, but with Europe itself. Europe, it's argued, suffers from a post-Christian identity crisis. This is an argument also given, for example, by the American intellectual and think tank wonk, Francis Fukuyama. Europe is suffering from civilizational exhaustion. It lacks pride in its achievements, in its heritage, and the result is apathy and exhaustion. This makes Europeans disinclined to defend the democratic ideals expressed by the State of Israel, the argument goes. At the same time, there is a growing Muslim presence in Europe, which exerts pressure on European politicians to support Palestinian claims and to oppose the policies of the State of Israel. This is where the politics of multiculturalism is said to come in. And on top of that, Shepherd's point and others point to an alliance between European left and European left intellectuals and Islamism, not least in opposition to the war in Iraq, and then this carries over into opposition to the policies, or indeed, in some cases, the existence of the State of Israel. So that's the argument, and I confess my response is one of skepticism, to put it mildly. But I think it is a useful argument in the sense that it brings together a number of themes. And if we address these themes as questions, I think it can be useful, not only because it means we can evaluate the argument itself, but also because we can examine the relationship between the terms of the argument. What is the relationship between the rise of ethnic and cultural diversity in Europe and the politics of Israel and Palestine as it is enacted in Europe? What and how do both connect to experiences of antisemitism and Islamophobia? These questions came into focus in conversations I had initially with colleagues at the University of Haifa, especially with Professor Aryeh Kochavi, who I'm very pleased is here today, and they're questions which have been developed with colleagues and partners in New York, in Berlin, and in Paris. And this is the first of a series of workshops which will try to develop these questions in those different locations. So the focus over the next couple of days is on these questions in the British context, and then there will be further sessions in Paris, in Berlin, in New York, and in Haifa. Today, as I say, we're concerned with the UK, and specifically today, the discussions take an academic focus, addressing these questions from different disciplinary perspectives. Tomorrow, there'll be a shift of focus to giving space to advocates and activists of different sorts. But the key point about tomorrow's program is not so much to give a platform to different activists and advocates to put forward their claims, although I'm sure they will do so, but rather I've encouraged them to reflect upon the political, social and cultural conditions in which they pursue their chosen cause. And that, I hope, will help tell us something about the conditions of politics and culture in Britain today in relation to the questions that I set out before. So that's all I have to say, really, in terms of a sort of introduction to be excessively grand, the intellectual program for the next couple of days. There are a couple of organizational points I'd like to mention before we move on. One is that, unfortunately, Didi Herman has been struck down with illness and has had to withdraw and can't be here today. Malaya Malik has also been struck down with illness. You can see the evidence, but has very bravely come. I suspect had Didi not withdrawn, she might have taken the option of doing so, herself. So I'm especially grateful to Malaya for making this great effort. One of my colleagues, Dr. Becky Taylor, who was going to chair the last session today has also been struck down. Maybe divine intervention, who knows? But I'm extremely grateful to Adam Sutcliffe of King's College in London, who has agreed at very short notice to chair the last session.
What I'm going to do is offer some simple historical reflections with a view to developing understandings of the situation of British Jews and Muslims in the present conjuncture. What I hope to do is shed light on questions such as, are Muslims the new Jew, as has sometimes been recently suggested, and so on. And what I argue, somewhat discursively, is that there are as many similarities as there are differences between their experiences. I also argue that it is a degree of historical amnesia, and that is at the heart of the construction of the tropes and discourses that Ben Gidley was flagging up. So just sort of in a sense, those 5 or 6 tropes that he did, perhaps you could keep those in mind. What I want to do is obviously say that multiculturalism today, for many, has become a dirty word. The current government insists Cameron's Munich speech last year is anything to go by, and I'll sort of reiterate what Nasser was saying earlier, under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we have encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and the mainstream. We have tolerated these segregated communities behaving in ways that run counter to our values. In other words, multiculturalism now takes the blame for the radicalization of Muslim youth and the phenomenon of homegrown terrorism, held responsible for the dangerous sense of alienation that supposedly builds among young people living in separate communities. 5 years earlier, in June 2006, almost 12 months after 7/7, obviously a key moment in terms of damaging multiculturalism's reputation, Tony Blair spoke at the ceremony held at Bevis Marks Synagogue to mark the 350th anniversary of the readmission of the Jews to England by Cromwell in 1656. In his words, throughout the years and since then, the community has shown how it is possible to retain a clear faith and a clear identity and at the same time be thoroughly British. As the oldest minority faith community in this country, you show how identity through faith can be combined with deep loyalty to our nation. Implicit in his comments was the advice to British Muslims to follow this model community. He was able to do this, as politicians seem to do frequently, through historical erasure, leaving out a whole history of conflicted relations between the British state and society on the one hand and the Jewish community on the other, not dissimilar to Muslims. For instance, like Muslims from the late 20th century, Jews too in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were widely viewed as an alien religious community antagonistic to British society. They too were seen as a source of political subversion, terrorism, and revolutionary violence, a threat to national security. Their loyalty too was questioned, and they too were repeatedly challenged politically to renounce other Jews. Like Muslims, a century later, when their demeanors were put down to the nature of Islam, the virulently negative stereotyping of Jews came out of Christian contempt for Judaism. Like Muslims, immigrant Jews were perceived to be backward, uncivilized, unassimilable, and prone to political radicalism and violence. In the press and parliament, they were accused of sympathy and connections with terrorism abroad. Russian Jewish immigrants in Britain were all potential agents of world revolution who might unleash terror at any moment. During the First World War, the anti-war movement, borne out by the reluctance of Russian-born Jews to fight on the same side as the Tsarist Empire, made them the target of widespread opprobrium. Fast forwarding to 1946-47, in the context of a later conflict, British Jews were suspected of aiding Zionist terror in Palestine, and it was feared that Jews may become a party to it within Britain. The state opening of Parliament in November 1946 was accompanied by intense security to deter Jewish terrorists. MI5 warned the government that Jewish underground groups in Palestine were planning to launch attacks on targets in the UK. A few months later, the Sunday Times challenged British Jews to denounce Jewish terrorism in Palestine. 1 year later, on the August bank holiday weekend, mobs incensed by atrocities against British troops in Palestine smashed up synagogues and Jewish-owned shops and desecrated cemeteries in Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, and East London. In reaction, some young Jews, like their Muslim counterparts today, were attracted by radical movements which offered not simply faith, but an alternative ideology, a sense of belonging, solidarity, and a means of political mobilization. So, similar to some British Muslims confronting British security forces at home and abroad more recently, during the post-Second World War conflict in Palestine, British Jews overtly or covertly worked with Zionist underground in Palestine and in Europe, some joining armed units. So the image of a Jewish community distinguished by civic service, loyalty, and rectitude that Tony Blair painted disingenuously, I might add, ignores the Jewish experience, which uncannily parallels, albeit, and I think this is important, in a different context, that of British Muslims. Nevertheless, despite the challenges facing them, the Jewish community was able, by the early decades of the 20th century, to achieve a substantial measure of civic and religious equality, not, if it must be acknowledged, without prolonged negotiations. And so have British Muslims. But concessions made to the latter seem to have met with much greater resistance and opposition than those made to the former. Jewish cultural and religious claims, ritual slaughter, Jewish schools, and the rabbinical courts, Sunday trading, dress codes, seem to have been accepted without a great deal of protest. But when Muslims began to make analogous demands, halal meat, Muslim schools, recognition of Sharia councils, arranged marriages, the hijab, these were accompanied by controversy and indeed quite intensely charged resistance. Why? Perhaps because in the more religious context of Victorian and Edwardian Britain, Jewish demands were seen as reasonable. In the more secular framework of the late 20th century, and they have been perceived as running counter to the liberal values of British society. So, while the processes at work in reaching these accommodations are similar, the reactions seem to have been quite different. Perhaps it was because Jews in the 19th century Britain pursued an explicitly assimilationist strategy of Anglicization, in which Judaism played no role in the public sphere. This rendered them relatively invisible and their ethno-religious claims less exposed to contention. But all this happened in the absence of any form of multiculturalism. Indeed, initially, multiculturalism, when it did first appear on the agenda in the 1960s, was introduced precisely as a response to the failure of assimilationism in regard to the education of immigrant children. More broadly, from the 1970s, it came to be accepted positively as an effective strategy for managing the emerging diversity in British society. By the 1990s, the backlash against multiculturalism had begun. The 2001 disturbances in England's northern towns were blamed on decades of multicultural policies. In right-wing philosopher Roger Scruton's view, multiculturalism was a recipe for disintegration. To Yasmin Ali Bhai Brown, the discourse of multiculturalism no longer offered a shared narrative of who the British are today. In the words of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, mentioned already by Nasser, this was not a multicultural Britain, but a kind of plural monoculturalism, a Britain composed of separate cultures coexisting rather easily, side by side, in effect, living apart together. But when we look at the post-1945 evolution of British society, while we do see ethnic segregation, I would suggest that it is not evident that the policies of multiculturalism are its primary cause. Ethnic residential concentrations were the consequence of mass immigration of primarily manual workers into inner city industrial zones. Subsequently, these demographic patterns were exacerbated more by fear of racism and white flight than by self-ghettoization. Research shows that all minorities, including Muslims, want to live in mixed neighborhoods, and ghettos are created by those who move out. Moreover, contrary to the belief that segregated neighborhoods breed intense religious and cultural identities, and such communities should be dispersed to form ethno-religiously mixed neighborhoods, recent studies suggest that for Muslims more than non-Muslims, when other demographic and socio-economic characteristics are kept constant, intense identities are more prominent in relatively mixed neighborhoods. The Labour Party's adoption of community cohesion as a response to the 2001 disturbances, which was designed to bring diverse and mutually hostile communities together, did not prove successful, mainly because this policy of community cohesion did not address structural inequalities and disadvantages rooted in the material processes and conditions that seem to underlie the antagonism between communities. Indeed, the sources for their separation may be more credibly located in what was the growing media-filled Islamophobia evident in wider society, as well as a British foreign policy that many British Muslims perceive as inimical to Islam, and also the undeniably draconian measures introduced by the Labour government to combat Islamist terrorism. As we all appreciate, the terrorist attacks in New York, 9/11, and particularly since 7/7 in London, it placed multiculturalism under tremendous criticism. The fact that the UK has produced some homegrown jihadist terrorists has been widely deployed as ammunition in the battle against multiculturalism. Hence, Michael Nazir Ali, Bishop of Rochester, tells us that multiculturalism is to blame for perverting young Muslims. Canon Malik likewise asserts that multiculturalism has fanned the flames of Islamic extremism. And William Pfaff argues that these British bombers are a consequence of a misguided and catastrophic pursuit of multiculturalism. According to Gilles Kipel, British multiculturalism had been smashed to smithereens. With the impetus for all these events and responses being terrorism, it is questionable whether all or indeed any of these comments genuinely engage with multiculturalism, or whether it is the problem within Britain's multicultural society with which they were rather more concerned. While multiculturalism, or whether it is, such as critics argue on the surface at least, elevates difference and therefore enhances segregation, what underpins and clearly informs their argument and provides legitimization is the insistence upon the problems, perceived or otherwise, of Britain's Muslims. Consequently, they are viewed as something of a Trojan horse, embodying much malignancy, requiring a robust response. As Rod Liddell put it, it is Muslims and Islam, by attacking us, who we are, what we stand for, our way of life and our culture, by failing to integrate and assimilate, who are undoing and ultimately killing multiculturalism. Such comments, however, only seem to deepen the confusion as they homogenize and essentialize us as well as Islam and Muslims. What is often neglected in debates regarding Muslim demands is any awareness of the historic compromises that were arrived at between organized religions and European states. the stability pacts that were made between the majority churches and Judaism and secularizing European states in the course of 20th century adjustments to universal suffrage and constitutional reforms. A look at European history tells us that Christian heritage has profoundly shaped and continues to shape Europe's vocabulary, self-understanding, institutions, and practices. It needs to be reiterated that religion has continued to play an important part in the European public imagination and behavior. Churches are publicly supported and their ritualistic services consumed. While the religious historical roots may have been forgotten to some degree, religion continues to survive, albeit increasingly as culture, with many of the aspects retaining religious undertones. Thus, ongoing conflicts in Europe today are not necessarily or automatically due to the unwillingness of Muslims to accept secular norms, since the norms and policies are themselves not necessarily secular, though this reality is rarely, if ever, publicly acknowledged. If we accept these developments, then it would be clear that Muslims pose no particular problems. They are simply a new interest group and a new constituency, and European political systems should change to incorporate Islam as they did in respect of other religions in the past. Indeed, Muslims are asking for no more than to be accommodated within the existing structures, though this would require some rethinking as the continued assertion of Christian values tends to marginalize them rather than include them as equal citizens. Nevertheless, many questions remain. To what extent do we need similar values, norms, and symbols to form a harmonious society? Are Muslim practices at odds with Western values? Are diverse identities a threat to the stability and cohesion of modern nation states? How valid are the allegation of isolationism, separatism, and conspiratorial disregard for British norms and values, which continue to be leveled against Muslims? The last question becomes particularly relevant in view of the specific accusations that Muslims invoking multiculturalism's separatist principle refuse to share British values of tolerance and freedoms of expression and protest. This is mere speculation, since there is no evidence to suggest that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are otherwise predisposed. However, there is something else that is happening here. When Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron want everyone to share the common culture and their values, something that British politicians, irrespective of party affiliation, have been stressing in recent years, in reality, they're all implicitly asserting the supremacist character of their project and similarly setting aside the possibility of it being challenged or indeed being transformed in the process. This stance of the establishment is necessary in order to sustain their political power. If culture is about plurality, power is about unity. Multiculturalism is a threat because the state that we have depends upon a tight cultural consensus so as to deflect attention from the sources of social divisions and conflicts produced by material inequalities. Its instinct is to suppress conflict, maintain social cohesion, and more importantly, social order through consensus on moral values and practices that it hopes would deliver conformity. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, is intrinsically conflictual. Many of today's critiques of multiculturalism are politically motivated and hermeneutically loaded codes for cultural assimilation and socio-political domination. However, if state assimilationism is no longer a viable option in today's Britain, then we might ask whether cultural hegemony in the public space could be attainable. This is what Cameron, and more recently, the Conservative Party chairman, Baron Savasi, has been arguing for, arguably in terms of religion. While Varsi is prepared to concede that, and I quote her, people need to feel stronger in their religious identities, more confident in their beliefs. This is a nod in the direction of multiculturalism. Her view is that the best way to encourage social harmony is to put Christianity at the center of public life, thus reasserting the hegemonic status of the Church of England. But for many, she is naive in her thinking. As Giles Fraser points out, defending Christianity as a vital part of our national identity easily becomes code for defending Britain against Muslims. Behind Cameron's speeches, with Warsi acting as his useful fool, and those of Blair and Brown before him, lies nostalgia for a strong national collective identity, a Britishness with the Church of England providing the glue. However, this kind of Britishness has always been a hierarchical identity differentiated by race, ethnicity, religion, gender, class, and region. It remains contested because, as Mary Hickman has explained, I quote her here, identity politics and a politics of recognition flow from the contradictions that exist between the ideas of equality written into constitutions or articulated in notions of citizenship and the practices and politics that characterize everyday realities. So, a Britishness to which all can belong as equal citizens, as Tariq Maudud would like, requires a reformulation and reimagining, and that would necessitate a shift from the deeply embedded hierarchical values of empire, monarchy, and the established church, to which the power-wielding establishment is unequivocally wedded. Highly unlikely. Indeed, the rhetoric of anti-multiculturalism, in my view, seeks to distract political attention away from fundamental socio-economic problems and divisions that face deprived minority and majority ethnic communities alike, and which are actually caused by their material circumstances, competition for jobs, housing shortages, inequitable access to health, education, welfare, and social services. By refracting resentments and frustrations into ethnic conflict, David Cameron's rejection of multiculturalism represents an attempt to suppress potential challenges to the ideological hegemony of neoliberalism in maintaining the current social order. So finally, to end, if you like, on a note of optimism, at least for those who see it as a public good. The irony is that despite this assault, multiculturalism has actually continued to expand in government policy. The coalition government, for instance, is explicit in its promotion of new faith schools and the big society agenda, both of which look likely to encourage further ethno-religious communitarian tendencies. Multiculturalism lives on, albeit in new guises. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to talk today about the Jewish engagement with multiculturalism and how it's developed over the last few decades. What I'm saying is I'm going to be drawing on a book that I co-wrote with Ben Gidley, that came out in 2010 called Turbulent Times, the British Jewish Community Today. And I'm also going to add to what we argue there a little bit as well. I'm very grateful to be on the same panel as Nassar and Who I Am for giving us some quite interesting surveys of multiculturalism, both the concept, both the category and the term, as Nassar would talk about it. I'm going to use the term multiculturalism in this short talk, and I won't always explain it. And I know that that's unsatisfactory to a certain extent, but just as the term antisemitism is unsatisfactory, sometimes you need these terms in order to go on and simply to have any kind of conversation at all without being derailed by definitional issues. Broadly speaking, our argument in turbulent times is that Jews adapted late to multiculturalism, in the sense that the Jewish community in Britain has been here since the 17th century. It expanded rapidly in the last years of the 19th century, the early years of the 20th century. And by the time that the majority of British Jews came to this country, which is now really at least a century ago for the majority of them, although not all of them, Britain was not a multicultural country. Now, it's important to qualify that, as David Feldman did when he spoke on a panel with us when we launched the book, saying that, well, that doesn't mean we were necessarily a monocultural Britain either. In fact, multicultural and monocultural don't really describe adequately what Britain has been like historically. There's always been, on top of the fact that Britain is an amalgam of England, Scotland, Ireland for a lot of the time, and Wales, which of course is in a very complex relationship both to England and to Britain as a whole, there has always been, or at least there has been since the 19th century, at least some space for faith diversity in Britain. Now, but all that being said, I think it's true to say that until quite recently, the British Jewish community, or at least its leadership, or a majority of its leadership, was predicated on an assumption that Britain was a monocultural society to which Jews were a minority. We say in the book that the dominant strategy followed by the British Jewish communal leadership, particularly organisations such as the Board of Deputies and the Chief Rabbinate, was what we call a strategy of security. That was, in the dominant communal discourse, Jewish leaders tried to demonstrate to British society as a whole that we were loyal British citizens, and tried to urge British Jews themselves to be loyal British citizens, to be Jewish privately, and to be British citizens publicly, or English citizens publicly. Of course, the slippage between England and Britain is quite an interesting one, but we'll save that discussion for another day. And this strategy of security required that Jews be, if not invisible in the public sphere, then at least not assertive within the public sphere. The dominant political strategy in Anglo-Jewish history has been one whereby Jews have won various civil and citizenship rights through quiet, behind-the-scenes negotiations, outsourced, if you like, to the communal, the grandees of the community. Now, this was an apparently quote-unquote successful strategy, in the sense that in the post-war period, the majority of British Jews, although by no means all, became upwardly mobile, majority of them ceased living in poorer neighbourhoods such as the East End, moving out to suburban areas and living largely middle-class lives. Now, Jews have never been, even today, they are not homogeneously middle class, but nonetheless that is still the case with the majority. Now, this sense of a comfortable, settled, non-assertive community, largely middle class, became problematic when multiculturalism became an important discourse and also a fact of British society from the 50s and 60s onwards. The minorities that settled in Britain from the 50s and 60s onwards were less, not all of them, but many of them were less inclined to follow this kind of strategy of security, to be politically quiescent, to be invisible in the public sphere. And of course, a lot of them had no choice but to be this way. If you were black or Asian, you are much more identifiable. therefore you often face significant racism, which isn't to say that British Jews haven't faced anti-Semitism, but British Jews have been able to pass into British society much more effectively than other groups have become. Now, in this sort of, as it developed in the 60s and in the 70s, and Britain started to make this transition to an officially multicultural society, then a lot of elite Jewish discourse started to look a little bit anachronistic. And I'm going to show a quote here from the Chief Rabbi, Lord Emanuel Jacobowitz, who was Chief Rabbi until 1991. And he wrote a response to the Church of England's Faith in the City report in 1996, which was a very strongly worded, basically a defense of Thatcherite policies, but also a critique of multiculturalism. And here are a few extracts. On arriving here, we, that's the Jews, had cultivated trust in and respect for the police, realising that our security as a minority depended on law and order being maintained. And so, unlike Afro-Caribbeans, we did not riot. We were quite content for Britain to remain ethnocentrically British. Jews at the time were content to be patient, to wait and struggle for several generations to attain their social objectives, whereas we now live in an impatient age demanding instant solutions. It may be salutary to remind those presently enduring much hardship and despair that others have faced similar trials before them, and that self-reliant efforts and perseverance eventually pay off. Now, this is, you could not get a better statement of the idea that Jews represent a model minority, and of course a really quite explicit critique of other minorities, particularly at the time the black community. Needless to say, in terms of as an analysis of Anglo-Jewish history, it is at best incomplete and at worst complete cobblers, in the sense that whilst it's certainly true that what Jacobowitz is saying is what a large section of the Anglo-Jewish communal leadership was saying, be patient, be quiet, struggle, keep your heads down. There were large sections of British Jewry that did not act like this. There was, of course, in the East End, in the pre-war period, there was massive Jewish involvement in radical politics, in trade unionism, in anti-fascist activity, and so on. And I think what's interesting here is that this report really represents a late flowering of what really had become, by 1986, a pretty anachronistic strategy. And it was a strategy that was starting to fail for all sorts of reasons. Now, when the new Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, was inducted in 1991, he articulated what was ostensibly quite a different kind of discourse. And this was based on an analysis of Anglo-Jewry, that the strategy of security, it was not put in those terms, obviously, was caused British Jews to become too comfortable. They pointed to, people like Sacks pointed to demographic research, suggesting that the size of the Anglo-Jewish community had fallen dramatically from maybe about 450,000 in the immediate post-war period to around 330, 350,000 in the late 80s. The numbers are actually disputed, but and of course this apparent disappearance was seen as being partly to do with intermarriage, and although there were never exact figures at the time, but in 1990 a report had come out in America suggesting that the intermarriage rate was about 50%, and that was seen to probably apply to Britain as well. It was seen to be as a result of intermarriage, but also to do with assimilation. So this sort of pinpointing of the problems of this strategy of security led to what we call a strategy of insecurity being articulated, in which doom-laden prognostications of the future of Anglo-Jewry were routinely made in the 1990s, both by Sachs and by other Jewish leaders, saying that we are disappearing, we are going to die as a community, and that we have to do something about it. And this led to a significant period of institutional innovation to try and resist what was known as a continuity crisis. I won't go into all the highways and byways through which this institutional change happened, but within about 10 or 20 years, there had been some significant changes in Anglo Jewry in a number of respects. In one respect, British Jewish organisations professionalised, became more efficient, became slicker in what they did, or at least attempted to be. Jewish schools, Jewish education was seen as a priority, and massive investment was put into Jewish schooling, to the extent that the percentage of British Jewish children attending Jewish schools, I didn't bring the statistics, I should have, shot up to where now in 2012 the majority of primary aged children at least do attend Jewish schools, and new Jewish schools are opening all the time. Again, whether this was actually an appropriate response or not, I'll leave to one side. I think what's important is to suggest that this was an explicit and highly concerted attempt to turn back the tide, to create a more educated, involved British Jewish community that would be less likely to assimilate, that would be less likely to disappear. Another strand of this was a greater public visibility of Judaism. One example of that was under Ken Livingstone's mayorship. For 2 years in a row, there was something called Simcha on the Square, which was basically a big celebration of Jewishness in Trafalgar Square, which is the sort of thing that was very rare, if not actually non-existent in previous generations of British Jewry, to publicly celebrate Judaism like that in the way that other minorities might do. All of this, I suggest constitutes a kind of cautious embrace of multiculturalism. Not necessarily multiculturalist discourse in its entirety, but a sense that British Jews needed to do what other minorities do, to be assertive in the public sphere, to celebrate their own identity, and to work hard to ensure that they did not disappear into British society. One articulation of this is, I've got how much, 5 minutes? I'm not going to read it all, Jonathan Sachs's book, The Dignity of Difference, which came out in 2003, which was a fairly impassioned critique of what Sachs called Platonic universalism, and a celebration of difference. Now, this isn't a celebration of difference in the sense that sort of radical theorists or sociologists of ethnicity talk about, but is nonetheless was quite noteworthy, and it's very difficult to imagine that Lord Jacobowitz would have done that. He says, for example, pluralism is a form of hope because it's founded in the understanding that precisely because we are different, each of us has something unique to contribute to the shared project of which we are part. Now, there are a couple of massive paradoxes in Jonathan Sachs's embrace of difference and pluralism that reflect wider issues and views in the Jewish community, and wider paradoxes. One of which was probably the most important one, was that whilst Sachs celebrated pluralism in British society, generally he did not celebrate pluralism in the British Jewish community itself. He was ultimately the chief rabbi of the United Synagogue. He did not see Reform Judaism as legitimate, and within the Jewish community he advocated what he called inclusivism, but not pluralism, which, as he understood it, meant embracing individual Jews while not legitimating their particular denominations. And if I had more time, I could go into the sort of the horrible knots that Sachs himself got tied up with because of this, and the impossible contradictions of his position. But I think what's interesting about this is that this paradox reflects an issue within multiculturalist multiculturalism itself, in that sort of most multiculturalist theory doesn't have very much to say about what happens within communities itself. And in cruder versions of multiculturalism, you have a sense in which particular community, a picture of homogeneous communities forming part of a monocultural Britain with sort of a unified leadership representing them in a public sphere. I'm not saying academics necessarily advocate that kind of multiculturalism, but in its cruder versions, that often what happens. The second paradox is that this increase in public, confident, multiculturalist Judaism went alongside a public embrace by much of the Jewish leadership, including Sachs, of the idea of the new anti-Semitism, which was an idea that grew from 2000, 2001, which was that a new anti-Semitism was rising in British society, in which Jews were attacked not so much for being racially or religiously different, so much as for being Zionists, for being supporters of Israel. Anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism, that kind of thing. Sachs himself talked about a tsunami of anti-Semitism. British Jewish leaders would talk publicly and strongly about the new anti-Semitism, and would in a way that earlier generations of Jewish leaders would simply not have done. In the 1930s, the Board of Deputies was officially against, for example, the action on Cable Street against the British Union of Fascists, counselling, again, quiet, patience, behind-the-scenes negotiation rather than officially articulating grievances. And, of course, this new anti-Semitism discourse is, of course, in a way the apotheosis of the multiculturalist moment in the Jewish community, in the sense that in multiculturalism, different minorities feel comfortable in articulating grievances within the public sphere. Now, that isn't to make a judgment, again, on whether new anti-Semitism theory is right or wrong, simply that it's a sign of multiculturalist adaptation. Now, more recently, Sachs himself has critiqued multiculturalism. In fact, he's been one of the people that have been part of the backlash that both Humayun and Nassar were talking about. He said in his book, The Home We Build Together, multiculturalism has run its course and it is time to move on. And instead of that, he talks about society as a home that we build together. Because we are different, each of us has something unique to contribute. Now, it was interesting hearing what Nazar was saying, is the sense that often this public repudiation of multiculturalism often goes alongside essentially multiculturalist policy making, and to some extent, but only to some extent, if you actually read Sachs's book, that the Home We Build Together was essentially a zombie multiculturalist's critique of multiculturalism, in the sense that he did not repudiate his sense that difference was something to be valued. Now, that isn't to say that his critique of multiculturalism is necessarily a fair one. But what it is, as a critique of multiculturalism, it is not simply a return to the past. It is not simply a return to the sort of thing that Jacobowitz was saying, that we are a model minority and other minorities should keep their head down. It was a much more sophisticated than that, even though in some respects it is highly reactionary. Just to finish, I think, I focused here because we haven't had much time on Sachs, but obviously I could have said much more about other leaders and other thinkers in the Jewish community. But I think what Jonathan Sachs's work shows is some of the contradictions, anxieties and paradoxes that reveal tensions and problems within multiculturalism, however you define it. I'll just briefly outline three. One is that, as I said before, multiculturalism, in whatever version you talk about, has been poor in dealing with questions about internal diversity, internal pluralism. Second of all, multiculturalism, in whatever form you talk about, has not dealt well with questions of continuity and questions of cultural survival, particularly those versions of multiculturalism that celebrate hybridity have not dealt very well with anxieties amongst minorities that they will disappear in a hybrid future. And thirdly, and this really, to an extent, this echoes what Nassar and Humia have been saying, is that multiculturalism, the brand multiculturalism, has kind of become toxic. It's become associated with a particular crude version of multiculturalism, which may or may not ever have been explicitly articulated, but is sometimes the way that multiculturalism has worked in practice. And this leads to a fairly polarized and often quite shrill debate, which actually hides the substantial commonalities between people's positions. I'll stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.